for you to hear from Elizabeth, the inspiration of the California TrustLine. I get to do this. Elizabeth graduated from Stanford with honors. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona, Tucson in philosophy. I know. She has been a keynote speaker around the country, focusing us all on the importance of children's rights, the prevention of child maltreatment, disability rights, and most recently, on the critical nature of interconnection. Liz, I pass the torch and the cape to you. It's time to share your story with my superheroes, the R&Rs and the APs of California. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor for me to be here, and thank you, Mom. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm not totally sure how I'm going to follow that. The story of how TrustLine came to be. It's as much my story as it is my mother's. And in our own way and time, my mother and I have each had to gather together the often fragile, broken, and knotted strands of our lives and thread them through, hand over hand, weaving a narrative that could nurture hope and change in ourselves and our community. Part of reweaving my story has been to share my experience with people who would listen. I began this early, as far back as age 4, sitting on Art Agnos's lap. He's sitting over there. It's wonderful that he's here tonight. And during one of the TrustLine's first hearings, and the head of the committee at that hearing turned to me and asked if I had anything I wanted to say, and I most certainly did. I eagerly took the microphone and exclaimed, "We need a big rule for grown-ups." So once that big rule for grown-ups was on its way to being a reality, I was 8 years old, and my mom invited Bill Baker to our home. I was prepared. Even then, I understood, perhaps implicitly, the persuasive power of giving voice to my own truth. My mother's journey with TrustLine empowered me to feel, even at that early age, that I was growing into a bright young woman ready to stand. And so I sang the Little Mermaid song, hoping I could reach out beyond the divisions I so strongly felt around me, divisions between the blind and the sighted, which I understood all too well. And incidentally, divisions among political parties, which I knew nothing about. I sang because I wanted so badly to finally feel part of your world. I sang to create connection, and that's exactly what happened. My gift to form authentic connections with others led me to the many opportunities I had as a teen and young adult to deliver keynote addresses at conferences on child abuse prevention across the country. I always began those speeches by sharing the extent of the violence inflicted on me as an infant, and how I struggled to belong, to be accepted as a person with a disability at school, at home, and even within my own heart and mind. As children, how many of you also struggled to find acceptance, longing to be seen for who you are, whether you experienced abuse in your past or faced prejudice due to disability, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, or gender? The list of ways we discriminate is staggering, isn't it? Were you simply a confused and conflicted teenager? It's probably all of you, right? We all have a story to share. Today, I understand that my story does not need to begin with what happened to me. And neither does the story of TrustLine. The makings of TrustLine did not begin with my birth, with my mother's story, or her mother's story, or her mother's story. The story of TrustLine is a story greater than the story of one event, one mother's vision, one life, one family. It has become part of the story of every legislator we met, every R&R agency we collaborated with, that's many of you out here, every parent who was touched by our message or used TrustLine's resources, every child whose safety TrustLine has protected and assured. There is tremendous power in sharing our stories. It allows us to grow in resilience and self-acceptance, and invites us collectively to cultivate compassion for each other, strengthening the bonds of belonging we already share. Stories are powerful because they allow us to see ourselves reflected in the lives of others. They help us to remember that we are all living more or less the same human experience. By encountering and participating in the stories of others' lives, whether past or present, we recognize others as second selves and appreciate just how interconnected we are. When my mother would bring me as a child to TrustLine meetings and events, it was easier for people to realize that what happened to me could happen to anyone, even their own child. They were able to relate to us on a more personal level. Of course, data is also vital when trying to affect social change or respond effectively to the overwhelming numbers of natural and man-made disasters confronting us constantly with more tragedy and more loss. But we must remember that numbers can only speak as numbers. They cannot speak as people. They cannot convey the grief of an already impoverished family who has now lost everything they own. The fear felt by a working mother who has no idea how her children will be cared for now that her affordable child care center burned down. The despair of a mother who just learned that her child was violently shaken and might die. Though data eventually did become a crucial component in TrustLine's conception, my mother initially relied almost exclusively on the power of our family's story, helping others remember that we are all part of one human family. Each of you, R&R agencies and alternative payment groups, programs, become part of that story, the story of TrustLine. Every time you tell someone about TrustLine, every time you advocate for safe sleep practices, every time you find care for a child, every time you match that child and their temperament with what best meets their needs. By showing up day after day to advocate for our children, we work together to realize a world in which children will no longer be kept in shadows of a problem too complicated to solve, part of a knot too twisted to untie, and therefore left alone. And when, one day, we realize that none of us are alone, that we all play an integral part in sustaining each other in this interdependent world, we will understand that there is no knot too difficult to untie, that we do not belong to different threads. So the theme for this conference tonight is honoring our superheroes, and I cannot think of a more appropriate description for the people here tonight. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. You do not need to have superpowers to be a superhero. Superheroes are advocates who know change comes from drawing people together rather than driving them apart. Superheroes are leaders who not only tear down barriers, but build bridges. Superheroes, quote, save their communities, not by acting invincible, but by being willing to be vulnerable, willing to tell their stories. And when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we become open to forming genuine relationships with others, despite the inherent uncertainty involved. It is this engagement in being vulnerable which is so necessary to making and sustaining authentic connection. We are superheroes not because we are fearless, but because we are willing to face our fears, not because we have learned to be free from the pain of the past, but because we have learned to be free to be the authors of our present. The superheroes I admire are the weavers of connection. They are people who can unwind the knotted woundedness in others, who know how to unravel destructive patterns and reconnect us with our passion and purpose, with the thread of our story which can draw us together. When I was 14, I was chosen to run in the 100th Olympic torch relay. Across the entire country, one beautiful, radiant light was passed from one hand to another, and then another. Everyone worked together to carry the Olympic torch, the lighted flame from Atlanta, where the Olympic Games were taking place. It took the cooperation of thousands of people willing to run, take up the torch, and pass it on. Each one of us here today has a job to do to ensure that the narrative our children are born into is a story about protection, compassion, love, and belonging. As individuals and as organizations, it is our responsibility to keep the flame alive, to pass the torch to our children and our children's children and to our children's children's children. To help heal the divisions in this terror-ridden and grief-stricken world, even a little is no small thing. Nelson Mandela spoke to the heart of this challenge when he said, "It is our light not our darkness, that most frightens us. So I challenge you, my fellow superheroes, to shine your light anyway. And it's okay to be scared. And since we superheroes are here to inspire and light the way for one another, I'll leave you with a poem I wrote called The Song of Belonging. I longed to belong, so I tried crossing out my differences, hoping this is what would mend each great divide. I longed to belong, but felt so separate and so wrong, I sang another person's song and became a sea without a tide. I longed to belong, convinced there was something more to find, and wandered weary and dissatisfied until I stumbled through the door within that led me back inside. And through it all, I laughed and cried, and when I heard you do the same, suddenly my tears dried. And I realized our lives are but a single thread. Our raw moments of connection are the knots tying us together, and from the strands of our own song, we weave the story we become into something beautiful and strong, part of the fabric pattern of the world. And our world is starving for love. We are yearning for meaning, to hear the song of every life, and our children need us to voice what lies within. How else can we leave them their beginnings? How else can we guide them to live? By the wonder shining out through their eyes, even when they're old. We long, and all along who we are remains quietly waiting. To be here is your right, so stand up and be strong. You spark a flame from hand to hand. It's your turn to shine your light. So I pass the torch to you tonight. Thank you.